I'm going to start at the very beginning. My first piece of published writing was a short story in a school magazine. Not the Portmeuthian, but the Secundrian, school magazine of the Southern Grammar School in Portsmouth. In the 1970s, there was no national curriculum, and I benefited from having a teacher who encouraged creative writing, or composition, as it was called in those days. I remember the thrill of seeing my story physically in print in that magazine and distributed throughout the school, and I enjoyed the kudos I got from it. I don't think one gets the same frisson from digital publications as one does from a printed work. And that thrill is still there 50 years later whenever I have anything published. If you're seriously interested in writing, then I do urge you to contribute to the Portmeuthian or the Portsmouth Point magazine and blog, which welcomes factual and opinion pieces, as well as, I believe, poetry and fiction. So how did I come to write my first book? When I was doing my degree, I chose to study an area that hadn't been researched at the time, that of the role and conduct of the Portsmouth Military Tribunal that considered claims of conscientious objection on various religious, political and moral grounds during the First World War. I'm not a pacifist myself, but what attracted me to the subject was the tension between individual freedom and the needs of one's community or country at a time of heightened nationalism. A few years later, I embarked on my first book, Keep the Home Fires Burning. This was a history of Portsmouth in the First World War. My research involved scanning through every edition of the Hampshire Telegraph and the Portsmouth Times for the war years on a state-of-the-art microfiche reader in the Central Public Library. The disadvantage of digital searching these days is that one can go straight to a search term in a text without getting any sense of what surrounds it, without getting any sense of the context. I found that scanning whole newspapers was an excellent way of immersing myself in the period. The language, the propaganda, the adverts, the classifieds, the letters, the news reports, the crime reports, all contributed to building almost a sense of living at the time from day to day. This experience provided not only a lot of information for the history book, but also played a big part in giving authentic background to the novel I wrote 15 years later called Mudlark. I'll come back to that a bit later. There's a temptation or a risk following university to write like an academic, but if you want people to read what you write, you have to put aside that discipline and communicate in both an interesting and accessible way. Keep the Home Fires Burning was published by the Portsmouth News, which was then in the business of publishing local titles. An advantage of having a local newspaper publish it in those days is that they publicised it well. This was the days before the internet, when a large proportion of households had a daily newspaper delivered. Other books followed, commissioned by different national publishers who published local history titles. One was this, Portsmouth in Defence of the Realm. This had a good balance of both text and images. Books with old photographs sold well, and I was under no illusion that for a large number of readers my carefully crafted text was not the main attraction for buying the books. At the same time, I was writing occasional articles for Hampshire magazine, now defunct, about various subjects, including at a time when the Tory government was considering privatising public libraries, a history and defence of the public library service in Hampshire and the Isle of Wight. I also enjoyed a short-lived career as a cartoonist with a local newspaper, which I briefly described on the Portsmouth Point blog last year. At the same time, I was keen to write a novel. I was reading bedtime stories with my daughter, and as you know, toddlers, young children, love the same stories over and over. What I used to do, partly out of boredom with the same old stories, partly to entertain and amuse my daughter, was to deviate, subvert, riff with her favourite familiar stories, which she loved. Creativity of any type is fun, especially the sharing of it. It took some years for me to find the time to devote myself to writing a full novel. I wrote a book for my daughter, which I didn't show anyone else, and then a time travel novel, which I sent out to literary agents. I was extremely lucky. On the basis of it, I was taken on by a long-established and respected agency in London. Being represented by a literary agent was essential to getting your manuscript read by national publishers. As you will appreciate, publishers are deluged with novels from hopeful authors. Agents provide some sort of quality control, enabling publishers to consider more manageable number of submissions. The time travel novel, intended for young teenagers 11 to 14, went unpublished, but my next novel, following the very sensible advice to write about what you know, was a story inspired by events I had discovered 15 years earlier whilst researching the First World War. While some novelists literally make it up as they go along, I started with a basic idea, a basic plot. Between my starting point and where I wanted it to end, there was a lot of fun to be had. My protagonists were two mudlarks, boys who dived and competed with each other for coins thrown into the sea or the mud off the railway pier down at the Hard in Portsmouth Harbour. The mudlarks of Portsmouth were famous or notorious, depending on your point of view. To the police and people who thought themselves respectable, they were beggars, thieves and scavengers, Portsea lowlife. Mudlarks, however, believed themselves to be entertainers, putting on shows for the visitors, dockyard workers, soldiers, sailors and tourists arriving by ships and train. Jimmy and Reg were the sons of sex workers, though this is only alluded to in the text. Prostitution and mudlarking were ways of making ends meet for the Portsea poor. This was in the days before a Labour government introduced the welfare state with unemployment and sickness benefits, child support and the National Health Service. Throughout the book, the boys share a deep mistrust and disrespect for authority of any kind. The police, the judge, royalty, the media. The fact that Jimmy and Reg didn't know their fathers is an important theme, and one which hopefully has a satisfying resolution in the book's penultimate chapter, when a bond emerges with a father figure. The final chapter, alas, is less happy and echoes the very beginning, with the mud of Portsmouth Harbour replaced by the mud of the Somme trenches, where it was lethal shrapnel and not coins that filled the air. In those 2 years, the span of the book, the boys grow up. So the book begins at the start of war in 1914 with the discovery of a skull in the mud of Portsmouth Harbour. We join the story here, having established in the Jimmy and Reg as mudlarks in the first chapter at the outbreak of the First World War. We join it here midway through chapter 2. As you can see in the first paragraph, Reg has a stutter, something I won't represent in this brief reading, from a third of the way down, page 16 on the left. It was then that he noticed the human skull. It was lying on the edge of the water, gleaming white against the black mud. Reg gave a shout and beckoned to us with his black arm. We waded out further, gathering around, gradually realising what it was, not daring to get too close. Reg picked up a bit of driftwood, leant forward and poked it. Suddenly there was a scratching, scurrying sound. The skull started moving. Jesus, you could have heard us scream on the other side of the harbour. I'll bet we were louder than the dockyard whistle. We freeze, the skull starts moving, and we're up to our knees in mud, unable to get away, to create some distance. Then Archie laughs, nervously. I turn my head and see dozens of green and orange crabs spilling out through the eye sockets. Their little legs gently tap against the bone, and the skull amplifies the sound of their frantic escape. That noise is everything I can hear, and I imagine them rattling around in my own skull, gripping and twisting with their pincers, feasting on my brain and eyes. I hear myself breathe out and say at the same time, bloody hell. Reg pokes my shoulder with his stick and makes me jump out of my skin. You thought it was alive, you Jessie. So did you bastard. I don't like being touched by the stick after it had touched the skull, but I don't say anything. We stare silently at the shiny, wet, grinning skull. The crabs disappear into a clump of slimy, flowing bladderwrack that lay strewn beside it, like an old wig. I don't know how long we stood there. It was one of those moments when you don't feel real, when you seem to be aware of everything and nothing. The gentle rhythm of the sea changed. The tide was starting to turn. We looked at each other. Nobody knew what to say. It was strange. It was like we were embarrassed, like we had seen something we shouldn't, something wrong or bad had happened, and we had found the evidence. We trudged back to Lily, who was happily ignorant of our find. It was Reg who spoke what was on our minds. Shouldn't we tell someone? Two thoughts occurred. Firstly, we didn't want to be cuffed round the earhole by the coppers for begging, because that's what they called mudlarking. They didn't think we were the eighth wonder. They thought we were scum. Second, we didn't want to get locked up and hung for murder either. If there was one thing you learnt early in Portsea, it was never trust the police, ever. Given half a chance, they'd stitch you up tighter than a kipper's corset and throw away the needle. Yeah, Reg, I said reluctantly. I suppose we're going to have to tell someone. So the novel is written in the first person from Jimmy's point of view. Writing in the first person seemed to me to be the best way to tell his personal story, but it does present difficulties in storytelling because other characters' perspectives can only be known through their actions and through dialogue with Jimmy present. Now, I'd just like to point out a few of the things I was attempting to do in that passage in terms of storytelling and language. Here there's a brief switch to current tense to give a sense of immediacy and drama. Throughout the book, which is aimed at the 11 to 14 age group, I attempt to give the impression of authentic period language that you might have heard in a tough area like Portsea. Both Jimmy and Reg were born in the language of the time out of wedlock, illegitimate. They were bastards. This status was heavily stigmatised at that time. The literal sense of illegitimate is outside of the law, and the boys were, to some extent, outlaws. And finally, at the end of this passage, we have this. Given half a chance, they'd stitch you up tighter than a kipper's corset and throw away the needle. This mixes up two old expressions, a simile and a metaphor, but also throws in a reference to corsets, which was a huge Portsmouth industry employing many sailors' wives. If I was pushed to describe in a few words what genre mudlark is, it would be ripping yarn meets grim reality. And I sensed a tension at Puffin, the publishers, between the editor, who loved the grittiness, the grim reality, and the all-powerful marketing people who wanted more adventure. I had a lot of fun with the dialogue in this book. The mystery to writing good dialogue is perhaps best expressed by Ian McKellen in his masterclass in acting, which if you haven't seen, I would heartily recommend. Thank you for listening. I think we have a few minutes for questions.